The corridors of Caligula's palace did not echo with debates about law or war. They echoed with whispers, hurried footsteps, and the sound of people pleading to be spared. Under his rule, Rome's elite discovered a new kind of terror, one that did not rely on mass executions or open rebellion, but on something far more corrosive. Fear that entered homes. Fear that sat at family tables. Fear that turned honor into a liability. This was not chaos. It was structure. It was policy. Cruelty was not an accident of power. It was its daily function. Everything was recorded, categorized, and processed with the same indifference Rome used to track taxes or grain shipments. Suffering had paperwork. Shame had procedures. And through this machinery, the most powerful empire on earth bent itself before a single man's will. To understand how Rome reached this point, we have to go back. Back to a moment of hope, applause, and celebration. Back to a young ruler who was welcomed not with fear, but with joy. Before we go any further, if you enjoy deep, unsettling history, the kind textbooks avoid, support the channel by liking and subscribing. These stories matter because they show how power really works when no one is watching. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, remembered by history as Caligula, a nickname taken from the tiny soldier boots he wore as a child, was not born a monster in the public eye. He was born a symbol, the adored son of Germanicus, Rome's most beloved general. When Caligula rose to power in 37 CE, the city erupted in celebration. For nearly 100 days, Rome feasted, prayed, and rejoiced. After years of suffocating fear under Emperor Tiberius, the Senate finally relaxed. The people believed the nightmare was over. Here was a young, educated, charming ruler, one who smiled easily, spoke eloquently, and promised renewal. No one imagined that this same man would later design one of the most methodical systems of moral collapse Rome had ever known. Caligula's childhood was split between privilege and trauma. He grew up among soldiers who adored his father, marching with legions who treated him like a mascot of victory. But he also witnessed the darker truth of imperial power. His father's suspicious death, his mother's exile, his brother's executions. One by one, his family vanished, not in battle but through politics. He survived by learning a dangerous lesson early. In Rome, honesty could get you killed. So he learned to perform, to appear harmless, to look foolish when necessary. Living under Tiberius taught him that survival depended on disguise. And Caligula became very good at hiding himself. When he became emperor, the transformation seemed miraculous. He cut taxes, released prisoners, restored public festivals, repaired roads and aqueducts. He rewarded the army generously. He walked openly among the people instead of hiding behind palace walls. Senators were invited to dine with him. He laughed with them, shared jokes, listened. Rome fell in love. Women scattered flowers in his path. Children sang songs praising his name. Statues were raised, not out of fear, but admiration. Felt like a golden age reborn. After Tiberius' cold distance, Caligula's warmth felt almost divine. Many genuinely believed the gods had answered their prayers. And then everything broke. In the autumn of 37 CE, Caligula was struck by a sudden, violent illness. For weeks, he hovered near death. Court physicians recorded uncontrollable fevers, convulsions, and delirium. He ranted through the nights, claiming to speak with the gods themselves. Rome held its breath. Temples overflowed with sacrifices. People made vows, offering their own lives in exchange for the emperor's survival. When he finally recovered, the city celebrated again. But those closest to him noticed something had changed. At first, the signs were subtle. Command here, an unusual order there. Then he announced that statues of the gods across Rome should have their heads replaced, with his own likeness. It was said as a joke, then repeated, then enforced. Caligula no longer slept. He wandered the palace at night, whispering to statues, staring at the moon, arguing with enemies no one else could see. Servants found him at dawn in the gardens, covered in dirt, claiming he was shaping Rome's destiny with his hands. Whatever that illness had taken from him, it had not taken his power. It had removed his limits. The change began inside the palace, among those closest to him. Family ties blurred. Boundaries dissolved. What had once been private became political. Loyalty was no longer enough. Obedience was not enough. Even silence became suspicious. This was the moment Rome did not recognize as a turning point. But it was, because Caligula was no longer ruling through popularity. He was preparing something far more effective. A system where fear replaced law, where participation replaced resistance, and where dignity itself would become a tool of control. By the time Rome realized what was happening, the machinery was already in motion. And in the next part, we'll see how Caligula transformed personal obsession into state policy, and why, once it began, no one in Rome could remain untouched. Power rarely announces its true intentions all at once. It tests boundaries first. It watches who flinches, who stays silent, and who looks away. After Caligula's illness, the palace atmosphere changed. The laughter faded. Conversations lowered to whispers. Servants learned to keep their eyes down. Senators discovered that proximity to the emperor was no longer a privilege. It was a risk. Caligula began reshaping how power worked, not through new laws at first, but through personal intrusion. Invitations to private gatherings became impossible to refuse. Attendance was framed as loyalty, absence as suspicion. These gatherings were not public ceremonies or political councils. They were intimate, unsettling affairs where boundaries dissolved and hierarchy was deliberately blurred. The emperor watched constantly, not just actions but reactions. Who hesitated? Who complied too quickly? Who tried to remain neutral? In Caligula's Rome, neutrality was the first crime. Gradually, what began as personal excess hardened into expectation. Noble households understood that their status no longer protected them. In fact, it made them targets. Prestige meant visibility. Visibility meant vulnerability. Caligula understood something fundamental about control. Fear works best when it is personalized, when it enters homes, when it threatens what people love rather than what they own. He started with symbolic acts. Seating arrangements that humiliated powerful men. Public jokes that stripped senators of dignity. Honors granted one day and revoked the next without explanation. A man elevated in the morning could be ruined by evening, not through execution, but through disgrace. And then came documentation. Rome had always been a bureaucratic empire. Caligula weaponized that instinct. Every interaction, every favor, every service was recorded. Names, dates, observations. The same meticulous care used to track census data or tax revenue was now applied to loyalty and compliance. Fear became administrative. Officials were appointed to oversee what the emperor called ritual obligations. Physicians, scribes, guards, all reassigned under the language of state service. No single individual carried full responsibility. Each person handled a fragment. And because everyone only touched a piece, no one could easily claim guilt or innocence. The palace itself was transformed. Rooms were repurposed. Corridors once meant for governance became spaces of surveillance. Everything had a function. Everything had witnesses. Everything could be recalled later. This was the true innovation. Caligula did not rely on spontaneous cruelty. He built systems that forced participation. Once someone complied, even once they were compromised. And a compromised person is far easier to control than a terrified one. The Senate felt this shift before the public did. Votes became unanimous. Debates vanished. Laws passed without discussion. Not because senators agreed, but because disagreement had become dangerous in ways no one could openly name. Religion was folded into the mechanism. Caligula declared his body sacred. To oppose him was framed not just as treason but impiety. Ritual language cloaked coercion. What could not be justified politically was sanctified spiritually. Families were pulled inward. Fathers learned that resistance endangered their households. Husbands discovered that honor was no longer a shield, it was leverage against them. Protection now meant cooperation. And Rome complied, not because its people were uniquely weak, but because the system left no clean hands. Once everyone had participated, even unwillingly, everyone had something to lose. This was no longer one man's madness. It was governance through degradation, a structure designed to break the bonds that held society together: trust, family, reputation, belief. By the time whispers spread beyond the palace, the damage was already irreversible. What had been private fear was now collective silence. What had been shock became routine. And that is when Caligula pushed further. Because once a society accepts humiliation as normal, the next step is obedience without resistance. In the next part, we'll see how this system expanded beyond the palace walls, and why even Rome's most powerful families found themselves trapped inside it, with no safe way out. Once a system stops shocking people, it starts sustaining itself. By the time Caligula's methods extended beyond the palace, Rome had already adjusted its expectations. What would once have sparked outrage now triggered calculation. People no longer asked, "Is this right?" They asked, "How do I survive this?" The emperor no longer needed to summon individuals personally. The machinery did the work for him. Orders moved through intermediaries. Invitations arrived stamped with official seals. Compliance was framed as duty, refusal as disloyalty. What made the system so effective was not violence alone, but predictability. Everyone understood the rules, even if they were never spoken aloud. Those who complied quietly were left intact. Those who hesitated became examples. Caligula expanded participation carefully. Not all at once. Always selectively. Prominent household here. A respected family there. The goal was not volume. It was visibility. Each public fall reinforced the lesson. No lineage was untouchable. Families began policing themselves. Fathers warned sons to stay silent. Wives urged husbands not to draw attention. Reputation, once a source of pride, became a liability to be managed. The safest position was invisibility. This was how normalization took root. Administrators refined procedures. Schedules replaced improvisation. Roles were assigned and rotated. The language became increasingly abstract. People were no longer discussed as individuals, but as entries, obligations, assignments. Distance made participation easier. Even moral people adapted. Some convinced themselves they were protecting others by cooperating. Some believed small compliance prevented larger harm. Some simply stopped thinking about it at all. Caligula understood that the most powerful control is not fear, but dependency. Once households relied on imperial favor for safety, advancement, or silence, they became invested in the system's continuation. Corruption became reciprocal. The Senate, once the symbolic heart of Roman authority, became a chamber of echoes. Laws passed that aligned conveniently with the emperor's needs. Legal language provided cover. If something was lawful, it could be rationalized. If it was ritualized, it could be excused. Religion played its role perfectly. Priests adapted theology to match reality. The emperor was framed as chosen. Obedience became virtue. Doubt became sacrilege. Public life continued. Games were held. Festivals celebrated. Markets thrived. To the average citizen, Rome looked prosperous, orderly, powerful. That was the final insulation. Horror hidden behind normality lasts longer. Those trapped inside the system rarely spoke to one another openly. Isolation was deliberate. When people cannot compare experiences, they doubt their own perceptions. Silence became contagious. Occasionally, resistance surfaced. Quiet refusals. Attempts to delay. Requests framed as misunderstandings. These acts rarely ended well. Not always through immediate punishment, but through steady pressure until compliance followed. What Caligula built was not chaos. It was efficiency, and efficiency outlives individuals. By the time opposition formed within the Praetorian Guard, the system had already embedded itself deeply into Roman life. Even those who despised the emperor had benefited indirectly. Wealth had flowed. Positions had been secured. Silence had been rewarded. This is the uncomfortable truth. Systems of abuse survive because they distribute advantage unevenly. Enough people gain just enough to look away. The question was no longer whether Caligula would fall. It was whether Rome could survive what it had become in the process. Because when power teaches a society that dignity is negotiable, restoring it is never simple. In the next part, we'll reach the breaking point, the moment when the machinery turned inward, when even its enforcers realized they were no longer protected, and when violence became the only language left. Every system like this ends the same way. Not with outrage, not with justice, but with panic. By the final year of Caligula's rule, the balance that had kept everyone compliant began to fracture. The emperor no longer calibrated fear. He flooded the system with it. When punishment becomes random, loyalty collapses. The Praetorian Guard had been the backbone of his survival. They enforced silence, controlled access, and removed problems quietly. But Caligula made a fatal mistake. He stopped treating them as partners and started treating them as disposable. Officers were humiliated publicly. Pay was delayed, then reduced. Promotions were promised and withdrawn. Insults replaced rewards. What had once been controlled terror turned into personal resentment. And resentment is dangerous when held by armed men. Rumors spread that Caligula was planning a purge within the guard. Whether true or not didn't matter. Fear doesn't require evidence. It only needs plausibility. The same mechanism Caligula used on Rome now worked against him. Conversations became coded. Looks replaced words. Trust shifted sideways, not upward. Small alliances formed quietly among men who realized the same truth at the same time. Loyalty no longer guaranteed survival. The emperor sensed it. Paranoia sharpened his behavior. He increased tests of obedience, demanding displays of submission that served no political purpose other than reassurance. The more insecure he felt, the more theatrical his cruelty became. That was the final acceleration. On January 24, 41 CE, during the Palatine Games, Caligula did what he always did. He isolated himself with confidence. He moved through restricted corridors with minimal protection, assuming fear would do the rest. Didn't. The assassins were not rebels. They were insiders. Tribune Cassius Chaerea, a man Caligula had repeatedly mocked and humiliated, struck first. Others followed immediately. No speeches, no declarations, just efficiency. The emperor died in a narrow passageway, cut down by the same system that had sustained him. But here's the part history often softens. The violence didn't stop with him. Within hours, Caligula's wife and young daughter were murdered. Not because they were threats, but because the system demanded closure. Loose ends were dangerous. Mercy was risk. Rome woke up to confusion, not relief. The Senate rushed to declare the restoration of the Republic, as if pretending the last years had been an aberration. But the machinery didn't vanish overnight. Too many people had benefited. Too many compromises had been made. Then they found Claudius, hiding behind a curtain, shaking, forgotten. A man no one had ever taken seriously. And that was precisely why he survived. He hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't built a system of fear. The guard proclaimed him emperor, not out of idealism, but out of self-preservation. Rome didn't reject imperial power. It simply swapped the face. That's the real ending of Caligula's story. Not a moral reckoning, a recalibration. The Senate kept its privileges. The guard kept its power. The public returned to daily life. And the system learned one crucial lesson. Excess visibility is dangerous. Abuse must be quieter to last longer. Caligula wasn't remembered as a warning because Rome wanted to forget how easily it participated. That's the unsettling takeaway. Tyranny doesn't survive because one man is mad. It survives because enough people adapt, benefit, stay silent, or tell themselves they have no choice. Caligula didn't fall because he was cruel. He fell because he stopped being useful. In the next and final parts, we'll pull back and expose what Rome never fixed. How the structures that enabled him didn't disappear, how later emperors refined them, and why this story keeps repeating across history in different costumes. Caligula's death didn't end anything. It edited the script. Rome didn't look at what happened and say, "This system is dangerous." It said, "This system needs better management." The problem wasn't absolute power. The problem was making people notice it. Claudius understood this instinctively. He had spent his entire life underestimated, mocked, ignored. That invisibility saved him. When the Praetorian Guard dragged him out from behind the curtain and declared him emperor, he didn't project dominance. He projected gratitude. That alone changed everything. Claudius paid the guard immediately. He doubled down on incentives instead of fear. Where Caligula humiliated, Claudius rewarded. Where Caligula demanded spectacle, Claudius worked quietly. The machine stayed intact, but the noise stopped. And Rome relaxed. That's how systems survive. Not by becoming moral, but by becoming tolerable. The Senate congratulated itself for avoiding chaos. The elite reclaimed a sense of dignity. The public stopped whispering. And the lesson hardened into doctrine. Cruelty is acceptable as long as it's procedural, bureaucratic, and distant. What Caligula exposed was not madness. It was transparency. He showed Rome exactly how naked power functioned. Later emperors learned to dress it better. Executions didn't stop. They were relocated. Confiscations didn't end. They were justified legally. Surveillance didn't disappear. It became administrative. The terror remained, but it wore paperwork instead of spectacle. That evolution is the most dangerous phase of any system. When oppression becomes routine, people stop calling it oppression. They call it order. This is where Rome becomes unsettlingly modern. The Praetorian Guard didn't just protect emperors. They shaped succession. They decided who lived close to power and who didn't. Loyalty was no longer to Rome or the Senate or the people. It was to continuity, stability above all else. That value justified everything. A bad emperor could be removed. A disruptive reformer could be removed. Anyone threatening equilibrium could be removed. The justification was always the same: preventing chaos. Caligula was retroactively framed as an anomaly, a monster, a cautionary tale. That framing was convenient. It allowed Rome to avoid asking harder questions about itself. Because here's the truth they didn't want to face. Every humiliation Caligula performed had an audience that stayed. Every abuse required compliance. Every boundary crossed had been preceded by silence. He didn't invent the system. He stress-tested it until it cracked. And instead of dismantling it, Rome reinforced it. This pattern didn't stop with Rome. You can see it echo through history. Leaders who push too far, fall violently, and are replaced not with justice, but with a calmer version of the same structure. The face changes. The incentives remain. That's why Caligula is remembered as insane instead of instructional. Because if he's just mad, no one else is responsible. But if he's a product of incentives, fear economies, and unchecked authority, then the problem isn't ancient. It's evergreen. That's the uncomfortable bridge between past and present. Systems don't need villains. They need participation. They need people who tell themselves they're just surviving. They need professionals who separate ethics from duty. They need citizens who trade discomfort for safety. Rome perfected that trade. By the time later emperors ruled, the public no longer expected virtue. They expected predictability. And predictability, even when cruel, feels safer than chaos. That's why Caligula's excesses were quietly useful. They taught Rome how far was too far. And everything short of that became acceptable. The nightmare wasn't that he ruled. The nightmare was how easily life went on afterward. Because when a society survives atrocity without transformation, it sends a signal. This can happen again, just more efficiently. In the final part, we're going to connect this directly to the modern world. Not with cheap comparisons, but with structural parallels. How public spectacle becomes algorithmic. How humiliation becomes digital. How systems of fear no longer need emperors. Only platforms. Only silence. Only participation. Rome did not fall because it was cruel. It fell because cruelty became normal. By the end of the imperial system, no one was shocked anymore. Not by executions, not by exile, not by confiscation, not by public humiliation. These weren't scandals. They were maintenance. And that's the warning history keeps trying to give. The most dangerous moment in any society isn't when violence erupts. It's when violence becomes procedural, when harm is handled by forms, committees, algorithms, or applause, when no single person feels responsible anymore. Caligula ruled through spectacle. Modern systems rule through distraction. Where Rome had arenas, we have feeds. Where emperors demanded loyalty, systems demand engagement. Where subjects once watched humiliation from marble seats, today millions watch from glowing screens, convincing themselves they're just observers. But observation is never neutral. Rome's citizens told themselves they had no power, that emperors were gods, that guards were untouchable, that survival required silence. And in a way, they were right. Individually, resistance was fatal. But collectively, passivity was lethal too. That contradiction never resolved. Rome kept choosing comfort over conscience, order over justice, stability over reform. And for a long time it worked. Roads functioned, grain arrived, armies held borders, until they didn't. Because systems built on fear don't collapse loudly at first. They hollow out, trust erodes.
Institutionsrot.
Loyalty becomes transactional. When crisis finally comes, nothing holds. Rome didn't die screaming, faded. The lesson isn't that power corrupts. The lesson is that power without accountability doesn't need to be evil to be destructive. It just needs to be unexamined. Caligula forced Rome to look at itself, and Rome blinked. It chose the easier story. Madness, anomaly, exception. Anything except admitting the structure itself was the problem. That choice echoes forward. Every time a society excuses abuse because it's legal, every time humiliation is justified as entertainment, every time silence is framed as neutrality. Those are Roman decisions. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes because humans repeat incentives. The point of telling Caligula's story isn't shock. It's clarity. If you think monsters destroy civilizations, you'll miss the real danger. Civilizations are undone by systems people defend because they benefit from them or fear what happens if they don't. Rome didn't need Caligula to fall. It needed everyone else to keep going as if nothing fundamental was wrong.